Hi, I'm Eric Houston, and I want to welcome you to the first of a series of programs examining the earliest years of motion pictures. Tonight, we're showcasing 40 films spanning 1888 to 1896. Oh, and a quick word, we've added some music to make tonight's films a little more palatable to modern audiences. But with only one exception, all of these films were silents. It's easy to think that the movies were invented by just one man, typically Thomas Edison. And while Edison was certainly one of, if not the biggest force in movies during the years we'll discuss, the very first movies were made by a man named Louis Le Prince. Here they are, the first two films ever made, Roundhay Garden Scene and Leeds Bridge. Both films are blink and you'll miss them short, so we'll run them both twice. Short as they are, those two films, the first ever made, proved that moving pictures would work. And for his contribution, Le Prince is now known as the father of cinematography. He made both films in October of 1888 with the images recorded on paper film. Meanwhile, Thomas Edison was working along the same lines, and he hired an engineer named William K.L. Dickson to make the dream a reality. That's Edison there in the middle and Dickson on the left. Dickson and his team worked tirelessly and filmed some of their first experiments, Monkey Shines No. 1 and 2, in 1892. The man you can almost see in these films is studio assistant Sacco Albanese. And as you can tell, we're not quite there yet. Inspired by the cylinders they recorded sound on, Dickson and his team first tried to create movies by printing microscopic images on a cylinder. They soon moved on to film and invented the kinetograph camera for filming. This next film, Blacksmithing Scene, was an early success. blacksmithing scene, which incidentally does not feature real blacksmiths, was the first film shot at Edison's Black Maria movie studio, seen here. Erected in early 1893 in West Orange, New Jersey, the Black Maria was a wood and tar paper structure built for just over $637. It got its name because it resembled a police van, then known as Black Marias. Dixon made several experimental films like this for Edison, including a barbershop scene in the run-up to commercial production. When ready, these films would be shown on kinetoscopes. This small device ran the film through a series of sprockets where it could be seen through a viewing scope. By April 1894, the kinetoscopes were ready for use and 10 were installed in the world's first kinetoscope parlor on Broadway. The month before, Harper's Weekly published an article about the new invention, showcasing stills from a film specifically made for the article. Among those first 10 films, and one of the most popular, was a film starring Friedrich Wilhelm Mueller, better known as Sandow, the father of modern bodybuilding. Also known as The Perfect Man and The Strongest Man in the World, Sandow became famous the year before, appearing with manager Florenz Ziegfeld at the 1893 World's Fair. Sandow's act featured feats of strength like lifting audience members and, like in the film, exhibitions of his muscles. Sandow waived his usual $250 appearance fee when making this movie in exchange for the chance to shake Edison's hand. This film is typical of those Dixon made for the Edison Company. By and large, these films focused on novelty and vaudeville acts that were appearing in New York at the time. Amongst them, the first film audiences tried to censor. She replaces Grace with an apparently untaught abandon. That's what the New York Times had to say about Carmencita. Carmencita was a Spanish dancer, and her performance in this hugely popular film was considered scandalous at the time. Why scandalous? Because the audience could see too much of her ankle and lower leg. Carmencita's other claim to fame was that, according to the New York Dramatic, her act was so popular it inspired a vaudeville fad that saw New York socialites flock to the often dingy theaters in droves. Up next, Dixon and Edison create the very first sports film. The Leonard Cushing fight was the longest film ever made at the time. Viewers would have to watch the fight 6 rounds on 6 separate, specially made, high-capacity kinetoscopes paying 10 cents a view. It was also only the first of many boxing films, as that genre would prove especially popular in the 1890s. In fact, it was so popular that Dixon had to film a truly unique match to stand out in the crowd. Another filmed vaudeville act, this is probably one of the best remembered films of the era, if only because it's so odd. Odd as it is, though, Professor Welton's act wasn't even original. It was a ripoff of another act, Professor J.W. Hampton's Boxing Cats. Still, Welton's were very popular, and his cats not only, quote, boxed like men, but rode bikes, turned somersaults, and walked through fire. Amazing though they may be, these cats couldn't hold a candle, either on screen or in the theater, to the peerless Annabelle. Annabelle Whitford, also known as the Peerless Annabelle, was a true vaudeville star and, like Sandow, debuted her act at the 1893 World's Fair. Her 3 films for Dixon and Edison were so popular that they had to be filmed over and over again as the negatives kept wearing out from demand. Because of this, she appeared in The Black Maria more than any other performer. She made 2 more films for Dixon and Edison, The Sundance and The Serpentine Dance. You may have noticed an early example of color film. In this case, the color was added years later, but like all turn-of-the-century color films, each film frame had to be hand-painted. Next, The Wild West comes to West Orange, New Jersey. Hodge Sharif was a knife thrower with the immensely popular Buffalo Bill Wild West show. Bill and his troupe were in New York in late 1894 preparing for a trip to Europe, and Edison was eager to film as many acts as he could before they left, including films featuring Buffalo Bill himself. Unfortunately, most of the Wild West show films are lost. Among the few that remain, Hodge Sharif and these next 2 films, one featuring bucking broncos, and the next featuring one of the few stars of the 1890s that we still remember today. That was, of course, the famous Annie Oakley. Annie's film was actually shot a good while after the rest of the Wild West show films, partially because Annie decided not to travel to Europe with the rest of the troupe. Instead, she toured in a comic play called Miss Rora, which saw her not only ride and shoot on stage, but act too. I think this is one of the real treats of early Edison catalog films, and is the only existing film of a true Western icon. It was one of the last films of an enormously successful 1894, but 1895 would not go so well for Edison. Edison began 1895 with a few remakes, including the creatively named New Blacksmith Shop and New Barber Shop. His intention was to update and replace some of the films that had been on the market for nearly a year. But as 1895 continued, it became clear to Edison that kinetoscopes were a fading fad. People were only so interested in plopping their nickel in a machine and watching a short vaudeville act. For a few months, Edison tried to revive the kinetoscope's waning popularity with all kinds of new and novel films. Perhaps his best idea was to add sound. Yes, while sound wouldn't truly come to the movies until 1927, Dixon and Edison were experimenting with it 30 years earlier. The only problem was, it didn't work very well. For this film, the sound was recorded to a wax cylinder, and Dixon and Edison had a lot of trouble getting the sound to reliably match up with the image on the kinetoscope. Interestingly, while we've always had the film footage from this experiment, the original wax cylinder and only copy of the soundtrack was thought lost until it was found in a stockpile of Edison cylinders in 1998. Meanwhile, this would be one of Dixon's last works for Edison. Tired of a lack of recognition for his work, Dixon left the Edison Company in April of 1895 and set out to form his own film studio. Up to that time, Dixon had directed virtually every film made at the Black Maria. With his departure, that duty would fall to cameraman William Heiss until a new director could be found. Among Heiss's solo films, the first ever on-screen special effect. That early special effect was one of Edison's last attempts to stoke the waning kinetoscope fad. Soon after the film was completed, Edison closed up shop on movie making for the rest of the year. Meanwhile, in France, the Lumiere brothers had a new idea for film exhibition. It was their idea to take the films out of the arcades and project them big and bold on a screen for the audience to see. Using a combination camera and projector of their own design, they created 10 films that they debuted in the Paris Grand Café in December of 1895. They called their show The Cinematograph, and it featured films radically different from Edison's. Instead of vaudeville acts, they showed brief comedy skits, like the immensely popular and often imitated The Sprinkler Sprinkled, alongside actualities, which were films of regular people doing regular things, like leaving work. Here now are those same 10 films shown in their original order. The cinematograph was an enormous success, and those 10 films would play all across Europe and eventually America. The Lumieres capitalized on their success by making many more films. Both of these next films were shot in 1896 and caused sensations in their own way. The second offering a rare glimpse into the pageantry of Tsarist Russia, and the first for supposedly frightening audiences who expected a train to leap out of the screen. As popular as that story was, though, didn't really happen. One of the many men to see the cinematograph show at the Grand Café was fellow Frenchman and magician Georges Méliès. Méliès immediately saw the power and possibility of film and tried to buy a camera of his own off the Lumieres for 10,000 francs. When they rebuffed him, he built his own and began making the first of more than 500 films, all of which feature a charming combination of special effects and whimsy. (1896) France also saw the debut film of the world's first female film director, Alice Guy Blache. A former secretary for one of the Lumieres' French rivals, Alice Guy Blache would go on to direct more than 1,000 films of her own, working with the likes of Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, and would eventually control the largest film studio in America. She is also credited with creating the narrative film, with this, her first. Meanwhile, in America, Edison saw what the Lumieres were up to and decided to follow their lead. He'd actually been working on a projector of his own for some time, but when it didn't work, he bought another from inventors C. Francis Jenkins and Thomas Armat. He redubbed it the Vitascope, and in March 1896 began producing films for a hungry American audience. The first of these, starring dancer Amy Mueller and a pair of popular actors respectively, were actually a lot like his previous films. The May Irwin Kiss was the most popular of the 1896 Vitascope films, and was considered fairly scandalous at the time, since it featured two people who weren't married to each other kissing. It's actually a reenactment of the last scene of a Broadway play called The Widow Jones. In October of 1896, the first permanent movie theater, the Edisonia Vitascope Theater, opened in Buffalo, New York. It had 72 seats, and each ticket was a dime. It likely showed the Lumiere brothers' cinematograph alongside a number of Edison's own new films, a combination of comedy scenes and actualities that were clearly designed to capitalize on the Lumiere's success. For our final film tonight, another early Méliès film. This one, arguably the first ever horror film, was the longest film ever made at the time, a whopping 3 minutes and 15 seconds. Enjoy it and join us next time for a look at more early film treasures.